Marcus Thompson stood perfectly still outside Buckingham Palace, his red uniform pristine, and his black bearskin hat sitting exactly as regulation demanded. Tourists snapped photos and children pointed at him, but he remained motionless like a statue. Most people saw just another ceremonial guard, someone who stood around looking impressive but probably couldn't handle real danger. What they didn't know was that Marcus had spent 8 years in the Special Air Service, Britain's most elite military unit. He had completed missions in places most people couldn't even pronounce, handled situations that would make action movies look tame, and earned respect from soldiers around the world. But now, wearing the iconic red tunic and standing guard at the palace, people assumed he was just for show. The other royal guards often whispered about Marcus during their breaks. He was different from them. While they chatted about football matches and weekend plans, Marcus kept to himself. He read books about military history, practiced his shooting skills at the range, and never joined their nights out at the pub. They thought he was stuck up, maybe even a bit weird. "Thompson thinks he's better than us," whispered Guard Johnson to his friend Williams during their shift change. "Always so serious, never wants to have a laugh. Probably couldn't hit the side of a barn if his life depended on it." Marcus heard these comments but never responded. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. His job was to protect the royal family and maintain the dignity of his position. What his colleagues thought about him personally didn't matter as long as he could do his duty. The palace had strict rules about discussing their backgrounds. Guards weren't supposed to talk about their military experience or previous assignments. This policy was meant to protect everyone's privacy and security, but it also meant that Marcus couldn't explain why he was so quiet and focused. His SAS training had taught him to observe everything and trust very few people. These habits didn't make him popular, but they had kept him alive in much more dangerous places than London. During lunch breaks, Marcus would often eat alone while the other guards gathered around tables sharing stories and jokes. He could see them glancing at him and whispering. Sometimes he caught words like robot or freak, but he just continued eating his sandwich and reading his book. He had been called much worse things by much more dangerous people. The truth was that Marcus loved his job as a royal guard. After years of high-stress military operations, standing guard at the palace felt peaceful. He got to serve his country in a different way, protecting the symbols of Britain's history and tradition. The tourists who took his picture had no idea that the man behind the stoic expression had jumped out of helicopters in the middle of the night and fought in battles that would never be publicly acknowledged. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Marcus was finishing his shift when Guard Stevens approached him. Stevens was one of the louder members of their unit, always ready with a joke or a story about his weekend adventures. He had been with the Royal Guards for 3 years and considered himself quite the expert on military matters, despite having only basic army training. "Hey, Thompson," Stevens said with a smirk. "We're all going to the shooting range tomorrow after work. Want to come show us your skills? Or are you too good for us regular folks?" The invitation was clearly meant as a challenge, not a friendly gesture. Stevens and the others had been making comments about Marcus's shooting abilities for weeks, suggesting that someone so quiet and bookish probably couldn't handle a real weapon. They had no idea that Marcus had qualified as an expert marksman in the SAS, a unit where shooting skills could mean the difference between completing a mission and never coming home. Marcus looked at Stevens calmly. He had 2 choices: decline the invitation and let them continue thinking whatever they wanted, or accept and risk revealing more about his background than he was comfortable sharing. The other guards had gathered around to hear his response, their faces showing a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "I'll be there," Marcus said simply, his voice as steady as ever. Stevens grinned, clearly pleased that his challenge had been accepted. "Excellent. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock, Westminster Range. Hope you're ready to learn something from the real shooters." As the group walked away, chatting excitedly about the next day's event, Marcus remained behind for a moment. He looked up at the palace windows, thinking about the royal family inside who trusted him and his colleagues to keep them safe. Tomorrow would change everything, but these guards had no idea what they were about to witness. Marcus had spent years hiding his true abilities, but sometimes the truth had a way of revealing itself, whether you wanted it to or not. The next evening, Marcus arrived at Westminster Range exactly at 5 o'clock. The shooting facility was a professional establishment used by police, military personnel, and civilian enthusiasts. The building had thick concrete walls and state-of-the-art soundproofing, making it the perfect place for serious firearms training. 6 of his fellow guards were already there, laughing and joking as they signed in at the front desk. Stevens waved him over with an exaggerated gesture, like he was greeting an old friend instead of someone he had been mocking for months. "Look who actually showed up," Stevens announced loudly. "I was betting you'd find some excuse to back out, Thompson. Maybe claim you had to wash your hair or organize your sock drawer." The others chuckled at Stevens's joke. Guard Williams, a stocky man with thinning hair, slapped Marcus on the back. "Don't worry, mate. We'll start you off easy. Maybe some target practice at 10 yards before we move to the real distances." Marcus nodded politely but said nothing. He had shot at distances these men couldn't imagine, in conditions they had never experienced, with stakes they had never faced. But explaining that would require revealing details about his past that he preferred to keep private. The range instructor, a former military man named Dave, greeted the group and led them to the shooting lanes. The facility had 20 lanes, each equipped with electronic targets that could be moved to various distances. The lighting was bright and even, designed to eliminate shadows and provide perfect visibility. "Right then, gentlemen," Dave announced. "We'll start with some basic exercises. 10 shots each at 25 yards, then we'll see who wants to try longer distances. Safety first, obviously. Keep your weapons pointed downrange at all times and wait for my commands." Stevens immediately claimed the lane next to Marcus, clearly wanting to show him up directly. "This should be interesting," he whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's see what our quiet friend can do when he can't just stand around looking pretty." The guards were issued standard service pistols, weapons that Marcus knew better than most people knew their own cars. During his SAS training, he had fired thousands of rounds through similar firearms, learning to hit targets in complete darkness while exhausted under pressure, and in every conceivable combat situation. As they prepared for the first round of shooting, Marcus noticed the other guards checking their weapons with the casual confidence of people who thought they knew what they were doing. Stevens in particular seemed eager to demonstrate his supposed expertise, loudly explaining to Williams how to properly grip the pistol. "The key is to stay relaxed," Stevens said, completely unaware that Marcus was listening. "Too many people tense up and ruin their accuracy. It's all about breathing and trigger control. Simple stuff, really." Marcus almost smiled at the irony. Stevens was explaining basic concepts that any first-year military trainee would know, while standing next to someone who had been trained by the world's best marksman. In the SAS, missing your target wasn't just embarrassing, it could get you and your teammates killed. Dave called for attention and explained the scoring system. The targets had 10 rings, with the center bullseye worth 10 points and the outer ring worth 1 point. A perfect score for 10 shots would be 100 points, something that even experienced shooters rarely achieved. "Remember, gentlemen," Dave continued, "shooting is about consistency, not just accuracy. Better to hit the 8 ring 10 times than to hit the bullseye twice and miss the target 8 times. The first shooter was Williams, who approached his lane with obvious nervousness. His first few shots were scattered around the target, hitting mostly in the 5 and 6 rings. By his 10th shot, he had managed to score 62 points, which earned him supportive comments from his friends. Guard Johnson went next, performing slightly better with a score of 71. The others took their turns with scores ranging from 58 to 76. Stevens shot last among the group, clearly saving himself for a dramatic finish. Stevens approached his lane with theatrical confidence, making a show of checking his weapon and adjusting his stance. His first shot hit the 9 ring, earning appreciative whistles from his audience. He followed with several more solid hits, maintaining his showmanship throughout the exercise. When Stevens finished, his score was 83 points, easily the best of the group. He turned around with a huge grin, accepting congratulations and good-natured backslaps from his colleagues. "Not bad for an old soldier," Stevens said, clearly pleased with himself. "Years of training, you understand. Can't just pick up a gun and expect to hit anything important." All eyes turned to Marcus, who had been watching quietly from the end of the line. The atmosphere in the range had shifted slightly. What had started as friendly competition was now feeling more like a test, with Stevens's score setting a high bar that everyone expected Marcus to fail to reach. "Your turn, Thompson," Stevens called out. "Don't worry if you don't do as well. Shooting isn't for everyone. Takes a certain kind of person to really excel at it. Marcus walked to his lane without saying a word. He picked up his weapon and checked it with movements so smooth and automatic that they looked almost mechanical. The other guards watched with interest, expecting to see nervousness or hesitation. Instead, they saw something they didn't recognize: the calm, methodical preparation of a true professional. Marcus stood at the firing line, holding the pistol with a grip that looked effortless but was actually the result of thousands of hours of training. The other guards had gathered behind him, some still chatting about Stephen's impressive performance. The range instructor Dave watched with professional interest, always curious to see how different people handled firearms. Marcus raised the weapon smoothly, his breathing automatically falling into the rhythm he had learned years ago in Hereford, the home of SAS training. The target 25 yards away might as well have been painted on the wall next to him. During his military service, he had regularly hit targets at distances that would challenge Olympic marksmen, often while under enemy fire. His first shot rang out, crisp and clean. The electronic target system immediately displayed the result: a perfect 10, dead center in the bullseye. The casual chatter behind him stopped abruptly. "Lucky shot," Stevens muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Marcus fired his second shot without any visible change in his stance or breathing. Another perfect 10, so close to his first shot that the holes nearly overlapped. The silence behind him was now complete, broken only by the whispered curse from one of the guards. By his fifth shot, Marcus had 5 perfect 10s clustered in a group smaller than a coin. The other guards were now leaning forward, trying to see the target display more clearly. Dave, the range instructor, had moved closer as well, his professional interest clearly piqued. Stevens was no longer making jokes. His face had gone pale, and he kept glancing between Marcus and the target display as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The other guards were equally stunned. They had expected Marcus to struggle, maybe score in the 60s like most of them had. They certainly hadn't expected to witness shooting that belonged in a military manual. Marcus continued firing with mechanical precision. Each shot was identical to the last: same grip, same stance, same breathing pattern, same smooth trigger pull. His 6th, 7th, and 8th shots all found the center of the target, creating a group so tight that it looked like it had been punched by a single, perfectly round hole punch. Williams leaned over to Johnson and whispered, "Where did he learn to shoot like that?" Johnson shook his head, equally puzzled. He never mentioned any training. Always acts like he's just a regular guard. For his 9th shot, Marcus made a tiny adjustment to account for the slight difference in this particular weapon compared to what he was used to. The shot landed exactly where he intended, another perfect 10, continuing the impossibly tight group he had been building. Dave had seen thousands of shooters over his years as an instructor. He had worked with police marksmen, military snipers, and Olympic competitors. He knew world-class shooting when he saw it, and Marcus was displaying skills that went far beyond anything a typical Royal Guard would possess. As Marcus prepared for his final shot, the atmosphere in the range had completely changed. What had started as a casual challenge between colleagues had become something else entirely. The other guards were witnessing a level of skill that most of them had only seen in movies. The 10th shot was identical to the previous 9, another perfect 10, placed with surgical precision in the center of the target. Marcus lowered his weapon and stepped back from the firing line, his expression unchanged from when he had started. The electronic scoring system displayed his results for everyone to see: 100 points. 10 perfect shots. A score that even professional marksmen rarely achieved, and certainly not with the casual ease that Marcus had demonstrated. The silence stretched for several seconds before Dave broke it with a low whistle. "In 20 years of running this range," he said slowly, "I've seen maybe 3 people shoot a perfect 100 on their first try. And none of them made it look that easy." Stevens was staring at the target display like it had personally insulted him. His score of 83, which had seemed so impressive just minutes earlier, now looked amateurish by comparison. The easy confidence he had displayed all evening had evaporated completely. "How?" was all Stevens managed to say. Marcus set down his weapon and turned to face the group. For the first time that evening, he allowed himself a small smile. "Practice," he said simply. Williams found his voice first. "What kind of practice?" That wasn't regular army shooting. That was something else entirely. Marcus looked at each of his colleagues in turn. These were men he worked with every day, men who had been mocking him and treating him like an outsider for months. Part of him wanted to keep his secrets, to walk away and let them wonder, but another part of him was tired of pretending to be less than he was. "I might have had some additional training," Marcus said carefully, still bound by the confidentiality requirements of his former unit. Dave stepped forward, his experienced eye recognizing something the others had missed. "Additional training," he repeated thoughtfully. "That grouping, that consistency. I've seen shooting like that before. Special forces, wasn't it?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the gunshots. The other guards looked between Marcus and Dave, trying to understand what was being suggested. Stevens had gone very quiet, perhaps beginning to realize just how badly he had misjudged the man he had been mocking. Marcus met Dave's knowing gaze for a long moment. The range instructor had clearly recognized something in his shooting style that marked him as more than just a well-trained soldier. Dave had probably worked with Special Forces personnel before, and knew the telltale signs of their advanced training. "Something like that," Marcus replied quietly, neither confirming nor denying the implication. Stevens finally found his voice, though it lacked all of its earlier bravado. "Special Forces? You mean like the SAS?" Marcus didn't answer directly, but his silence spoke volumes. The other guards exchanged glances, their minds racing to process this new information. The quiet man they had been dismissing and mocking for months might be one of Britain's most elite soldiers. Johnson stepped closer, his voice filled with disbelief. "If that's true, then why are you working as a Royal Guard? Why didn't you tell us?" "Because it doesn't matter," Marcus said simply. "My job is to protect the royal family, just like yours. What I did before doesn't change that responsibility." Dave nodded approvingly. "Professional discretion. Respect for that." He looked at the target display again, then back at Marcus. "Would you be interested in trying some longer distances? We have targets out to 100 yards. Stevens laughed nervously. 100 yards with a pistol? That's impossible. Nobody can hit a target that far with a handgun. Dave raised an eyebrow. "Want to bet on that?" The challenge was irresistible to Stevens, who was still struggling to accept what he had witnessed. His pride wouldn't let him back down, even though every instinct should have been telling him to quit while he was behind. "Fine," Stevens said. "But when Thompson misses, I want to hear him admit that his first round was just beginner's luck." Marcus looked at Dave. "Do you have the facilities for that distance?" "We do indeed. Lane 12 has electronic targets that can be positioned anywhere from 25 to 150 yards. Most people can't even see a target clearly at 100 yards, let alone hit it with a pistol." The group moved to the longer range, which was in a separate section of the facility. The 100-yard targets looked impossibly small from the firing line, like tiny dots in the distance. Even with the facility's excellent lighting, making out the individual scoring rings required considerable effort. Williams squinted down the range. "I can barely see the target, let alone the bullseye. This is mental." Marcus stood at the firing line and studied the distant target. During his SAS training, he had regularly engaged targets at this distance and beyond, though usually with rifles rather than pistols. Still, the fundamentals remained the same: breathing, stance, sight picture, and trigger control. The challenge was significant even for someone of his abilities. A pistol was inherently less accurate than a rifle at long distances, and the smaller target made precision exponentially more difficult. Wind could affect the bullet's path, and the slightest tremor in his hands would be magnified over the 100-yard distance. Stevens had regained some of his confidence. "This is where reality sets in, Thompson. Shooting at 25 yards is one thing, but this is impossible. Even military snipers use rifles for distances like this." Marcus ignored the commentary and focused on his preparation. He checked the pistol again, making sure he understood its particular characteristics. Every weapon was slightly different, and at this distance, those small differences could mean the difference between hitting and missing. Dave provided Marcus with a fresh magazine. "Standard service ammunition," he explained. "Nothing special about it. What you're attempting is extremely difficult, even for someone with your obvious skills." The other guards gathered behind the firing line, their earlier skepticism replaced by genuine curiosity. Even Stevens had stopped making jokes, perhaps finally understanding that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Marcus raised the pistol, using a two-handed grip that provided maximum stability. His breathing slowed and his entire body seemed to settle into perfect stillness. The distant target came into focus as he aligned the front and rear sights with mechanical precision. The first shot echoed through the range. Everyone strained to see the result on the electronic display. After a moment that felt like an hour, the system registered the hit. 8 points just outside the bullseye, but well within the target area. "Bloody hell," Williams whispered. "He actually hit it." Stevens was shaking his head in disbelief. "Lucky shot, has to be. Nobody can do that consistently." Marcus fired 4 more shots in quick succession, his movements economical and precise. Each shot found the target with scores of 9, 10, 9, and 8 points. The grouping wasn't as tight as his performance at 25 yards. But hitting a target consistently at 100 yards with a pistol was an achievement that bordered on the impossible. Dave was now openly impressed. "In 30 years around firearms, I've never seen pistol shooting like this. You're hitting targets that most people couldn't manage with a scoped rifle." The other guards were stunned into silence. They had come to the range expecting to embarrass Marcus and prove their superiority. Instead, they had witnessed a demonstration of skill that redefined their understanding of what was possible. As Marcus prepared for his final shots, Stevens found himself thinking about all the times he had mocked the quiet guard. Every joke about Marcus being soft or inexperienced now seemed not just wrong, but dangerously naive. If Marcus really was SAS, then Stevens had been insulting one of the most dangerous men in Britain. Marcus completed his remaining shots with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout the evening. His final 5 rounds scored 8, 9, 10, 9, and 10 points respectively. When the electronic system calculated his total score, it showed 89 points out of a possible 100, an almost impossible achievement at that distance with a pistol. The silence that followed was profound. Even Dave, who had seen exceptional shooting before, was clearly amazed by what he had witnessed. The other guards stood in stunned disbelief, trying to process the reality that their quiet colleague was capable of feats they had thought impossible. Stevens was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you, really?" Marcus lowered his weapon and turned to face the group. The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. For months he had maintained his privacy, deflected their curiosity, and endured their mockery. But now, with his abilities laid bare, there seemed little point in continued secrecy. "My name is Marcus Thompson," he said simply. "I've been a Royal Guard for 2 years. Before that, I served 8 years in the Special Air Service." The words hit the group like a physical blow. Johnson actually took a step backward. William's mouth fell open. Even Dave, who had suspected something along these lines, looked impressed by the confirmation. "The SAS?" Stevens repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "The actual SAS? Not just regular special forces?" Marcus nodded. 22 SAS Regiment. I was a sniper and assault specialist. The implications of this revelation were staggering. The SAS was legendary even among military circles. They were the soldiers other soldiers looked up to, the men who handled the missions that couldn't be officially acknowledged. Stevens and the others had been mocking a man who had probably done things they couldn't even imagine. Williams found his voice first. "Why didn't you tell us? Why let us think? Why let us treat you like what?" Marcus asked, though not unkindly. "Like someone who was different? Someone who didn't fit in?" The question made several of the guards visibly uncomfortable. They all remembered their comments, their jokes, their assumptions about Marcus being soft or inexperienced. Now those same comments seemed not just wrong but embarrassingly naive. Dave stepped forward. "If you don't mind me asking, why did you leave the SS? And why become a Royal Guard?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering how much to share. "I did my time. 8 years of operations around the world. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, places that don't make the news. I saw friends die, completed missions that cost me pieces of myself. When my contract was up, I wanted something different." He paused, looking at each of his colleagues. "Being a Royal Guard lets me serve my country in a different way. Protecting tradition instead of destroying enemies. Standing guard instead of kicking down doors. It's peaceful work. And after 8 years of war, peace seemed like a luxury worth having." Stevens was struggling with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling the man he thought he knew with this new reality. "But we've been, the things we said." "You said what you thought based on what you could see. Marcus replied. I never corrected those assumptions because they weren't interfering with my job. What you thought about my background didn't change my ability to protect the royal family. Johnson shook his head slowly. We've been complete idiots. All those jokes about you being soft, about not being able to handle yourself in a real situation. You could probably take all of us at once without breaking a sweat. Violence should always be the last resort, Marcus said. The SAS taught me how to fight, but more importantly, it taught me when fighting was necessary and when it wasn't. Your opinions weren't worth fighting over. Dave was studying Marcus with professional interest. The shooting style, the groupings, the way you handle the weapon. I should have recognized it sooner. You trained at Hereford, didn't you? With the regiment's shooting instructors? Marcus nodded. Some of the best marksmen in the world. They taught me that shooting isn't about showing off or proving superiority. It's about putting rounds where they need to go when lives depend on it. The comment was clearly directed at Stevens, who had the grace to look ashamed. His earlier boasting about his own shooting skills now seemed childish and embarrassing. He had been lecturing a master about fundamentals he barely understood himself. Williams stepped closer to Marcus. I have to ask, when you're standing guard at the palace and you're watching the crowd scanning for threats, you're actually seeing things we're missing, aren't you? Marcus considered the question carefully. Different training creates different awareness. I notice patterns, behaviors, potential problems that might not be obvious to others. It's not that I'm better than you, it's just that I was trained to see different things. That's why you're always so serious, Johnson realized. You're not being antisocial. You're working, really working. Every moment on duty is a potential threat situation, Marcus confirmed. The SAS doesn't train you to relax your vigilance ever. Dave cleared his throat. Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but we should probably wrap up. The range closes in 30 minutes. As they began cleaning up and preparing to leave, Stevens approached Marcus hesitantly. The swagger and arrogance that had characterized him all evening were completely gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. Marcus, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Actually, I owe you several apologies. The way I've treated you, the things I've said. I was completely out of line. Marcus looked at him for a moment. Apology accepted. But understand something, Stevens. Respect isn't earned through shooting scores or military credentials. It's earned through how you treat people, especially people you think can't fight back. The group left Westminster Range in a much different mood than they had arrived. The casual camaraderie and joking atmosphere had been replaced by thoughtful silence, as each man processed what they had witnessed and learned. Stevens walked beside Marcus, still grappling with the complete reversal of everything he thought he knew about his colleague. Can I ask you something? Stevens said as they reached the parking area. During all those months when I was giving you grief, did you ever think about setting us straight? About telling us who you really were? Marcus stopped walking and turned to face him. Many times. But what would that have accomplished? You would have treated me differently, but for the wrong reasons. Fear isn't the same as respect, Stevens. I didn't want people walking on eggshells around me because they were afraid of what I might do. Williams overheard the conversation and joined them. But we made your life miserable. All those comments, the exclusion from group activities, treating you like an outsider. That must have been frustrating. It was disappointing, Marcus admitted. But I've dealt with much worse than hurt feelings. In Afghanistan, I had Taliban fighters trying to kill me on a regular basis. Compared to that, some workplace teasing seemed fairly manageable. Johnson shook his head. You're making us sound even worse. Here we were, acting like schoolyard bullies to someone who's been in actual combat. That's not why I mentioned it, Marcus said quickly. I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. I'm trying to explain that perspective matters. What seems important in one context might not matter much in another. Dave approached the group, having finished locking up the range. Marcus, I hope you'll consider coming back. We occasionally host competitions here, and frankly, your skills would be an asset to any team. I appreciate the offer, Marcus replied, but I prefer to keep my shooting practice private. Tonight was an exception. Stevens looked confused. Why keep it private? With skills like yours, you could probably make money in competitions, maybe even teach classes. Marcus smiled slightly. Because the moment I start showing off my abilities, I stop being just another Royal Guard. I become the ex-SAS guy, and everything changes. People start treating me differently, expecting different things from me. Sometimes the best camouflage is being ordinary. The wisdom in this statement wasn't lost on the other guards. They were beginning to understand that Marcus's quiet demeanor wasn't antisocial behavior. It was a conscious choice to blend in and do his job without unnecessary attention. As they prepared to part ways, Williams asked the question they were all thinking. So what happens now? Do we just pretend this evening never happened? Go back to normal tomorrow? Marcus considered this. What's normal? If normal means treating each other with basic respect and professionalism, then yes, let's go back to normal. If normal means the way things were before tonight, then no. I hope we can do better than that. Johnson nodded vigorously. Definitely better than before. I feel like an idiot for all those assumptions I made. Don't feel like an idiot, Marcus said. Feel like someone who learned something important. We all make judgments based on incomplete information. The key is being willing to change those judgments when we learn more. Stevens was still struggling with his guilt. I keep thinking about all the times I called you soft or suggested you couldn't handle real pressure. Knowing what you've actually been through, it makes me feel terrible. Then use that feeling to be better in the future, Marcus suggested. Don't waste energy feeling terrible about the past when you could use that energy to make better choices going forward. Dave had been listening to the conversation with interest. If you don't mind an observation from an outsider, he said, what happened here tonight is exactly why I respect military personnel so much. Not just for their skills, but for their perspective. Marcus could have embarrassed all of you badly tonight, but instead he chose to turn this into a learning experience. The group stood in the parking lot for several more minutes, the conversation gradually shifting from apologies and revelations to more practical matters. They discussed their schedule for the next day, upcoming duty assignments, and other routine topics. But underneath the normal conversation was a new understanding and respect that hadn't existed before. As they finally began to separate and head to their cars, Stevens called out to Marcus one more time. Hey Marcus, tomorrow at work, would you maybe want to join us for lunch? I mean, if you're not too busy with your reading. Marcus paused by his car door. I'd like that, but I'm keeping the book. Some habits are worth maintaining. Stevens grinned. Fair enough. See you tomorrow. As Marcus drove home through the London streets, he reflected on the evening's events. He had successfully hidden his background for 2 years, maintaining the low profile that allowed him to do his job without complications. Tonight had changed that, but perhaps the change was overdue. The truth was that he had been lonely. The isolation he had imposed on himself for security reasons had become a habit, and habits could be prisons as easily as they could be protection. Maybe it was time to let his colleagues see a bit more of who he really was, even if it meant giving up some of his carefully maintained anonymity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new dynamics. His colleagues would treat him differently now, and he would need to navigate that change carefully. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt like he might actually have friends among his fellow guards, rather than just colleagues who tolerated his presence. 3 months later, Marcus stood at his usual post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. The red uniform was the same, the ceremonial duties identical, but the atmosphere among the guards was completely different. Where once there had been whispered jokes and deliberate exclusion, now there was genuine camaraderie and mutual respect. The revelation at the shooting range had marked a turning point, not just in how others saw Marcus, but in how he saw himself within the group. He had gradually allowed his colleagues to know him better, sharing stories from his military service when appropriate, and joining their social activities when his duties permitted. Stevens approached during a shift change, no longer the arrogant show-off he had been months earlier. The humbling experience at the range had forced him to examine his own behavior and attitudes, leading to genuine personal growth. Marcus, there's something I wanted to tell you, Stevens said quietly. Command has been asking questions about your background. Apparently word has gotten out about your SAS service. Marcus frowned slightly. He had been careful not to discuss his military record openly, but in a small, tight-knit community like the Royal Guards, secrets had a way of spreading. What kind of questions? The good kind, Stevens assured him quickly. They're not investigating you or anything. Actually, it's the opposite. There's talk about promoting you to a training position, maybe having you work with new recruits on threat assessment and response protocols. This was news Marcus hadn't expected. He had been content with his current position, enjoying the relative anonymity and straightforward duties. A training role would mean more visibility, more responsibility, and potentially more complications. I haven't put in for any promotion, Marcus said. Apparently you don't need to. Your record speaks for itself, and now that command knows what they have. They want to make better use of your experience. Stevens paused. For what it's worth, I think you'd be brilliant at it. You've certainly taught us a lot without even trying. Williams joined them, overhearing the last part of the conversation. Taught us what? How to be humble? Stevens laughed, but it was good-natured rather than mocking. Among other things, remember when you thought that suspicious tourist last week was just taking photos? Marcus spotted that he was actually conducting surveillance, mapping security positions and timing our patrol changes. Marcus had indeed noticed the man's behavior was inconsistent with normal tourist activity. Years of training had taught him to recognize when someone was gathering intelligence, rather than simply sightseeing. His quiet word to security had led to the man being questioned and eventually revealed as a journalist, working on an unauthorized story about palace security. That's just paying attention, Marcus said modestly. Anyone could have spotted it, but anyone didn't, Williams pointed out. You did. That's the difference your training makes. Johnson approached the group carrying a newspaper. Speaking of differences, have you seen this morning's Times? There's an article about Royal Guard training that mentions how some guards have exceptional military backgrounds that enhance the security capabilities of the unit. Marcus took the newspaper and scanned the article. It was a general piece about palace security, but it did include quotes from palace officials about the high caliber of personnel they recruited. While it didn't mention him specifically, he could see how his presence might have influenced the story. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, Marcus said with a sigh. The moment people start talking about exceptional backgrounds and enhanced capabilities, the job becomes about the person rather than the position. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Stevens suggested. The royal family deserves the best protection possible. If your experience makes you better at providing that protection, shouldn't that be acknowledged? Before Marcus could respond, their sergeant approached with an unusual expression on his face. Sergeant Mills was a 20-year veteran of the Guards who rarely showed emotion, so his obvious excitement immediately caught everyone's attention. Thompson, Mills said formally. You're wanted in the commander's office immediately. The group exchanged glances. Being summoned to see the commander was never routine, especially not with such urgency. Marcus straightened his uniform and followed Mills toward the administrative building, his mind racing through possible explanations for the summons. The commander's office was an impressive room, filled with military memorabilia and portraits of royal family members. Commander Harrison was a distinguished man in his 50s who had served with various elite units before taking charge of palace security. He looked up as Marcus entered and snapped to attention. At ease, Thompson. Please sit down. Marcus took the offered chair, noting that the commander's desk held a thick file that he suspected contained his complete military record. Harrison studied him for a moment before speaking. I'll get straight to the point, Harrison began. I've been reviewing your service record, and I have to say I'm impressed. More than impressed, actually. I'm wondering why someone with your qualifications is content to stand guard duty when you could be contributing so much more to our mission. Sir, I find guard duty fulfilling. I believe in the importance of protecting the royal family and maintaining the traditions of the service. Harrison smiled. A diplomatic answer, but I suspect there's more to it. You wanted anonymity, didn't you? A chance to serve without the complications that come with your particular background. Marcus was surprised by the commander's insight. Yes, sir. That was part of it. I understand the appeal, Harrison continued, but circumstances have changed. Word of your abilities has reached certain circles, and frankly, we'd be negligent not to make better use of your experience. He opened the file on his desk. I'm offering you a position as senior training instructor and threat assessment specialist. You'd work with new recruits, develop training protocols, and serve as a consultant on security matters. It would mean a promotion, a significant salary increase, and the opportunity to shape the next generation of royal guards. Marcus considered the offer carefully. It represented everything he had been trying to avoid: higher visibility, more responsibility, and the end of his comfortable anonymity. But it also offered the chance to make a real difference, to use his hard-earned skills to improve the security of the people he had sworn to protect. What would this mean for my current duties? Marcus asked. You'd still serve guard duty on rotation, but your primary responsibility would be training and assessment. You'd have your own office, a small staff, and considerable autonomy in developing programs. Harrison leaned forward. Thompson, I'm not going to pretend this is a small decision. This position would put you at the center of palace security operations. Your anonymity would be gone, but your impact would be significant. Marcus thought about his colleagues, about Stevens and Williams and Johnson, who had become genuine friends over the past months. He thought about the new recruits who would benefit from proper training, and about the royal family who deserved the absolute best protection possible. When would you need an answer, sir? Take your time, Harrison said. But not too much time. The position needs to be filled soon, and you're our first choice. Think about it. Discuss it with people you trust, and let me know. As Marcus left the commander's office and returned to his post, he realized that the quiet royal guard who had just wanted to serve in anonymity was about to become something else entirely. The shooting range had changed everything, and now he faced a choice that would define the next chapter of his life.